In this presentation, we will be taking a look at different kinds of water sources for country property. These can include surface water, such as creeks and lakes and ponds, and we'll also look at wells where the water is underground. We'll take a look at springs where the water is underground but coming out of the ground, and we will look at rainwater where the water is coming out of the sky. All of these methods can be utilized to provide domestic water and irrigation water for your country property. We'll talk about surface water and wells, springs, and rainwater.
Water, wells, and water purification, accessing and making water potable or drinkable. John 4:9-14 relates the story of Jesus at Jacob's well, speaking to the Samaritan woman and offering her the water of life, the water that if she would drink, she would never, ever thirst again. That is spiritual water versus physical water. Although our God can supply all our needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. He can supply our food wants, our water wants, and all of our needs. And we need to keep that in mind as we speak about the physical water that is provided for our physiological needs in various ways that we'll talk about today. So looking at water wells, there are different types of wells that are available historically and presently. The windlass and bucket well is a typical old-fashioned water extraction method from a hand-dug well like you would see in the lower right. And a hand pump, cast iron hand pump would extract a well from a wellhead like we see here in the upper right picture, which is a traditional way of extracting water from a well. Here's a diagram of a shallow well using a cast iron hand pump. See that the wellhead is elevated to help reduce any inflow of contaminants into the wellhead. Pretty good sized well. It has a manhole at the top, and also this one has an additional, looks like a suction well pump, because there's no additional well pump in the well, but there is a pipe that leads to a household. In that it's a shallow well, a suction pump could be used for that. You would need to have an in-well pump, submersible pump, if you had a deep water well, because water is more easily pushed than pulled. And so that could also have an effect on the types of hand pumps one might use for the well, depending on the depth of the well. Basically 4 different types of water availability from a surface standpoint. Don Leisky will talk about the collection of rainwater, but we can use like the river or streams, ponds, lakes for fresh water. The most common type of well is the water table well that you see on the right. That would have into an unconfined water aquifer, and that water would be accessed and seep in to the level of the aquifer, as opposed to an artesian well, which is in a confined aquifer that has impermeable layers above and below. Once that water is accessed, it's pressurized by the aquifer that it's in, and it rises up above the level of the aquifer, either right to the surface in the artesian well, or from a flowing artesian well, right out of the water, right out of the surface, out of the wellhead. So that can be under some pressure. The one pictured in the below is not under extreme pressure, but it is flowing continuously. And depending on the pressure associated with the artesian well, you may have enough pressure to actually run the household water supply without a bladder tank, which would be a huge blessing. No well pump and no bladder tank required. So depending on the type of well that you actually are able to access, there are different requirements that will be needed. A typical well pump scenario has the wellhead. It's handy to have a water extraction site right at the site of the wellhead. Typically, the water will be pumped to a bladder tank that could be in the house, could be out of the house in a well house of some nature. It has an electrical conduit that goes to the submersible pump, which penetrates the water column down in the groundwater aquifer. This is the unconfined water aquifer because the water level rises to the level of the aquifer as opposed to above it, which is what you would see in an artesian type of a situation. Water drilling for wells and water access in Washington State, the average is about $5,500, $30 to $50 a foot of depth. You can see that across the country. It's similar. Wisconsin, $25 to $50 a foot, and with a low and a high of $1,200 to $12,000, it should say. So that's based on depth and soil permeability or rock penetration and difficulties in drilling. So it kind of depends on your situation. And this is a typical well drilling rig accessing water. So if you don't have power, whether it's just the power's down or you're in a place where there is no direct power, you can do a solar system that charges a battery or does a direct feed at the time that you turn it on, depending on the daylight. Or you can do a hand pump type of an extraction method. Two different stainless well pumps are shown here. The one on the right, the Bison pump, is good for extracting from deeper wells. You can see that it's running right alongside of the electrical conduit and of a submersible well pump that's down in as well. So this would be a backup pump scenario in addition to the regular submersible pump down in the bottom of the well. You can always use a generator to provide backup power. You can run it directly to the pump, or you can have a portable receptacle that you use. And you can also have that in combination with the solar array or not, but you can also have things set up so that you can run your water with a generator, which is a helpful thing to maintain your water supply during any kind of a power restriction or outage. Something we've used, we have a shallow well. Ours is 37 feet. Our neighbor's is 37 as well, which indicates that we're in the same aquifer. But in order to extract the water from the well without power, we installed this handy well pump. And you can see that the water flows out of the handle upon pumping. It's a PVC-based pump. Because we had a suction pump, or have a suction pump, we had to do some wellhead modifications in order to actually implement this. But if you had an in-well pump, submersible pump, they have side-by-side holes that make the installation much easier than we found for ourselves. But they also make a stainless version that's more of a typical hand pump. So there are at least two different versions available at beingwater.com. If you don't have a well pump or electricity, you can also extract well water by using a casing bucket. Basically, it's a PVC section of pipe that is less than your casing diameter, and it has a valve in the bottom, either a floating ball or some other type of a valve system that allows it to drop into the well, and once the water gets into the bucket, it traps the water in the bucket from the bottom, and you can extract that back out of the well. If you have a deeper well, you can see the man using a tripod here to extract it. You can see the cap on the bottom of that with the valve that allows the water up into the bottom and then traps it once you begin to lift. Layman's.com sells a galvanized version of the same, and they have all kinds of non-powered household appliances and gadgets that are handy for off-grid situations. Here's a typical well equipment connection scenario. You have a deep water well in an unconfined aquifer. The far left is the deep well with a submersible pump. A shallow well, you can have both a suction pump or a deep water submersible. Actually, the one that's shown here has a foot valve in it, so it maintains the prime in the pump. You may need a storage tank. That's depending on your situation, and then that would go to a pressure tank, and then maybe to a household filtering system. You may require a water softener. It's a blessing if you don't. Then that goes into your usage areas, your sinks, your bathrooms, and then into your septic field and leached back in and filtered through the septic system and cleansed as it goes back to the aquifer. So that's the water cycle of a well scenario. So you could get hot water from an off-grid type of a system. You could send it from the well, have it preheated through a wood stove and then back into the hot water tank. You could also use a propane tankless water heater, or you could also power an electric water heater with solar panels, which would be a large power drain. You probably need quite a bank to do that on a regular basis due to the other power demands of a typical household. But there are different ways to do that. You might even use a propane water heater, that water reservoir, in addition to the tankless water heater, or separate. So just an idea, a flow diagram of heating your water as it comes into the home. So if you're utilizing surface water, you may need to purify that, or even if you happen to have a contaminated well of some nature, if you're purifying water or making it safe for drinking, the three primary ways of doing that with just having water and no additional equipment are boiling, addition of chlorine, and addition of an iodine tincture or tablets. Actually 4 different ways. And these take care of bacteria, virus, and various protozoa. The boiling method would require a rolling boil for at least 1 minute. That brings the water up to 212 degrees, which is well above the temperature that is necessary for killing the various things in the water. Chlorine also does a good job of purifying the water. So here's a chart that shows the amount of chlorine to add per volume of water. Be sure you use unscented chlorine as opposed to scented varieties, so you're not getting those additional factors into your water. You could use tablets as well. Both the tablets and the iodine tinctures require a 30-minute wait before drinking. And if you have cloudy water, you would add additional iodine. Chlorine, you may wish to let set for a while as well to allow the chlorine to off-gas before drinking. I would do that actually in a municipal setting where I had chlorine in the municipal water. I didn't care for the chlorine and didn't have a filtration system, so I would just let it sit on my counter and off-gas before drinking. One thing that these 4 methods of purifying does not do is remove sediment type contaminants. Only living type of contaminants, they're killed. But if you want to actually clarify the water and remove visible contaminants, then you would need a filtration system, which we'll talk about next. So various filtration, charcoal is a good go-to standby type of a filtration filter. So we use a First Dean filter on our backpacking excursions, have them handy. They can filter a large volume of water and are readily available and easy to use. The Berkeley filter would be a household version that you could use, a countertop, lots of different sizes there from the personal to the family level. There's other household water purification systems that use a charcoal-based filter that are available in addition. A ceramic type of filter uses the porous nature of ceramic to filter the water, and it flows through and drips into a receptacle, a bucket. This is just a diagram of a ceramic type of filter. You can put this under pressure too in a kind of a pump mechanism. There are various pumps that have a ceramic filter element. Here are a couple other versions of filters that are non-charcoal based, or at least partially charcoal. The Katadyn has a glass and charcoal element as a part of it. You can see it has a handy bottle top attachment, as well as a floating intake hose, so that it doesn't take sediment off the bottom. The Life Straw is a fiber-based straw that you can use on the go to just suck water out of a water source and get a drink. It works quite well. The only downside is that you can't actually utilize this particular instrument to filter a volume of water in a container. It's just simply drink and go. You could pick up the contaminated water in a container and suck out of it if you wanted to have it portable. And there's also the Sawyer system that can be used both inline in a hydration pack, in the lower right, as well as in the squeeze system by putting the contaminated water, dirty water, into a bag and squeezed through a filter. It also has a back flushing mechanism available with it. So both good systems.
Now I will delve into the subject of developing a spring and collecting rainwater. First of all, how to develop a spring. There's a website on the internet called Instructables.com that does a very nice job of explaining how to develop a spring, including videos and pictures that I have included here. Instructables.com. So they suggest several steps. The first step is, what type of spring do you have? There are basically two kinds of springs. One is a fissure in a rock, and the other is called a seep spring. So a fissure is water that's in a table, and it is confined to that level in the ground. And a seep spring is kind of a mushy area on the ground. In this particular presentation, as outlined by this Instructables.com site, they're specifically going to show us how to do a seep spring development. So when you go to their website, there is a substantial list of tools and equipment that you would need in order, materials and things to do this project. And again, you can look at their website, and I will add those to the description area to this video. Okay, step number 3 is digging out the seep. So you have found this wet area, and you need to dig down to find the source. And once you have dug the area, it makes a puddle, and so in order to develop it, you have to get rid of that puddle of water, and so you'd make a ditch, a trench, for it to relieve that water out of that hole. Next, you're going to encourage the water flow. So this can be a combination of things. One is to find where the water's coming out, such as on the left picture here, and you could maybe dig back into the hill a bit to try to find a little more open area of the source. And one thing about a spring is, once it is opened up, it will flow a little bit more over time, because it will rinse out what's blocking it. So you're going to do things to get the water to flow more. And then you're going to build up a dam to make a place for the water pipe to be installed. You will notice from this picture that once they have dug out this hole and they have found the source and made it flow as much as they can, then they line the hole with plastic so that the water that's collected doesn't absorb into the ground. And so that makes a kind of a little pool. And then they put rock, rinsed river run rock, drain rock it's sometimes called. They're round rocks that are rinsed, and they put that in so that the water has a place to go rather than a standing puddle of water. It's now interwoven in between the pebbles in the gravel. And then a dam is built at the end of it. In this case, they did it out of some plastic item. You could do it out of cement. They do make a fast drying cement for patching things. And so you could conceivably build a dam and have it dry in a matter of 5 minutes using cement if that's what you wanted. But however you do it, you build a dam. In this case, it was a piece of plastic, and they put a bung in to seal where the pipe comes out. In this case, they had 2 pipes. One, I would assume, is going to be their source that provides their water for their uses, and then the upper one would be an overflow so that this thing, when it's buried, wouldn't be floating out of the ground. So you're going to add the gravel and the plastic like we talked about, and this again would be rinsed gravel, which you would either rinse yourself or you can buy drain rock that's rinsed. And then when you're done, you've got this pipe coming out with water. And it doesn't take a lot of water for there to be a usable amount of water, because this will flow likely 24/7. And so a little trickle can accumulate a lot of water over a 24-hour period of time. Now, another great resource that I would highly recommend if you'd like to buy a DVD on how to develop a spring head, endtimepreparedness.com made a video where they went on site and they videoed the whole process. Unlike this website that has little snippets and some pictures and descriptions, this is a walk through of developing a spring head. And it's really well done and very similar to what we saw, except you would have it on DVD and you could pause and take notes, and it shows every single step and all the materials and everything. Now let's talk about rain harvesting. Sometimes it's called a rainwater catchment. And this website is, if you Google, and I'll put the link in the description below our video, but if you search for Billy Kniffen, notice how it's spelled. This gentleman has several videos of showing about how to do rain harvesting. And this is his home. He and his wife live in it, and they're in Texas. And as I recall, they get 15 inches of rain a year. That is almost like a desert. And so 15 inches of rain a year, and the only water supply that they have is the rain that they collect. And they collect it off the roof of their house, which is a 2,000 square foot roof. And they take the water off of their, what he calls the rain barn. Some people would call it a tank shed. And you'll notice his rain barn roof is bigger than his house because he's got some good sized tanks. If you look carefully at the picture, you can see Billy standing in the background in the shadows. So these tanks are probably close to 9 or 10 feet tall and 8 foot in diameter or so. And so anyway, he gets 2,000 square foot of roof off of his house and 3,000 off of his rain barn. Both of these buildings have metal roofs. Now you can collect rainwater on just about any kind of roof, but the roof of choice is metal for several reasons. One is it doesn't have a tendency to collect and retain contaminants like dust and pollen and bird poop or things like that. The other thing is that a metal roof, that water will slide off and rinse itself pretty quickly. If you want to get really picky about it, it's a good idea to do some research. If it is painted, this looks like it's probably galvanized, but if it's painted, research with the manufacturer of where was the paint made, because there are some paints that are more susceptible to being used for potable water than some others. And so you might want to research that and not just buy any old metal roof, because a lot of these metal roof materials are imported from China, and they're just a big roll, and they make it into the shape they want. And many times they have no idea what kind of paint's on there. It could be lead or some toxins or whatever. So I personally think it's a good idea to do some research into where the paint is manufactured, and find out whether it's acceptable for human consumption, because you will get a little tiny bit of rinse off over time. Now, from the roof, Billy has gutters, and you'll notice the downspouts aren't your typical sheet metal commercially made ones. These are PVC pipes, and one reason is that they're glued joints, so the water, if there is water pressure built up in the pipes, it won't leak out and lose it, and it has a tendency to be more smooth on the inside and keep rinsed out. You'll also notice that the pipe splits as it comes down the downspout, and so we'll talk about first flush diverters in a minute, but that's why it's split. Now, you can either put on the gutters some leaf guards, gutter guards. The best ones that I have found are stainless steel, and they're some that you could get at Costco. And then there are also some with bigger holes if the volume of water is a problem, from Lowe's or Home Depot. But if you don't have any guards on your gutters, you're going to get things build up in the gutter. So my preference is to have screens on the gutters. If you don't, this is another alternative, and that is, as the water comes down the downspout, it can go into this filter. And this unit has a trap door on the front. The water comes in one end and out the other, and passes through a screen that's on an angle. So if there are pine needles or some particulates like that, the screen will catch them and it will rinse it to the bottom of the screen, supposedly. And then periodically you come around. These are positioned at easily accessible heights. So if you had a two-story building with a downspout, you'd want to have it down at ground level where you can reach it about eye level. And then you just flip that open and take your hand and clean out the screen and go to the next one. There again, my personal preference is to have gutter screens, like a gutter guard. One caution about gutter covers is there is one, I think it's called a leaf guard, and it's solid metal with a curl on the end, and the water wicks down into the gutter and the leaves cascade off over the side. That's not as good a system for this purpose, because you want to capture all the water. You don't want it spilling over the edge. And so I would recommend, if you do this, that you have some kind of screen rather than something like the leaf guard approach. Now let's talk about first flush diverters for a minute. A first flush diverter, the purpose of it is when you have an extended period of time with no rain, like Billy would have with 15 inches of rain. He might have 6 months with no rain. And so what could happen is the roof could get some contaminants. It might be dust, it might be pollen, it might be needles, it might be bird poop, could be a number of things that are small that are cluttering up the roof surface. When it rains, those contaminants would rinse right into the gutter and go into your water supply, which technically isn't a really big deal because you're going to filter and purify your water. But if you use a first flush diverter on each downspout, then what happens is when it first rains after that dry spell, the picture on the left, the water will take the path of least resistance, which is down. So when this water in this illustration is going horizontal and then it's first raining, it's going to go down. As the water goes down into this tube, there's a ball that floats. So once the water gets to the point where that tube is full, Then the ball plugs the hole, and the rest of the water goes to the tanks. And then there's a little tiny pinhole at the bottom of this, so that little by little that water would weep out and drain. And then the contaminated, dirty water is in that tube rather than in your tanks. So that's a first flush diverter. There's another kind that can do the whole building, and I've seen one of these where it's like a small tank. The water comes in at the top, and the diverter volume, it captures the first amount of that water in the bottom, and then the rest goes out. It's the same idea as what we just saw, except it's a big one, so you could do your whole roof with one big diverter. So here is a picture of someone that has a first flush diverter, and that is the vertical pipe that goes towards the ground. That is the diverter. And otherwise the water goes into that water tank, which they are collecting water from the roof for the purpose of irrigation, I would assume. So, or they could be using it for domestic use as well. So that's what a first flush diverter looks like. It splits the pipe, and the path of least resistance, in this case straight down, is where the first run of water goes until that ball plugs that up, and then the rest goes into the water supply. So now we're back to Billy. We're in his tank shed, or his rain barn, and this pipe is showing his water coming from his roof, gutter and downspout, and instead of going to the ground, it's going across on a slight downhill to be able to go into the water tanks. Now here's Billy talking about his tanks. You can watch his video on YouTube, which I'll give you the link for that. And he has 5 3,000-gallon tanks, so he has 15,000 gallons of water to be able to provide his home for he and his wife, his domestic use, his showers, drinking water, and so forth. And then he has a smaller tank, a 1,500-gallon tank, which is in front of him there, that's for irrigation. So he came up with an ingenious way to be able to know how much water is in the tank. Now you could just thump on the tank and hear the difference. It'll go doink doink or donk donk, and kind of get an idea. But this is a little clear tube, flexible tube that's hooked into the outflow, and it goes up to the top. And when you open that up, the water level will go up the tube to the level that's in the tank, because it'll all level out. So you can look at the tube and you can tell exactly where the water level is. And what he does is he takes a piece of tape, like a masking tape, tapes it vertically on the side of the tank, and then he'll mark on the tape a date and what level he was at. And there are markings on the tank that tell you how many gallons, so you could then calculate how many gallons you had on a certain date. And then when a rainstorm came, if you had a quarter inch of rain, then you could see the difference, and then you could say, well, in a quarter inch of rain I gained this amount, and so if I have an inch of rain I get this amount. So that's pretty useful information when your whole water supply is dependent on the rain. Now, this is similar to what you might find with a well, but it's imperative with rainwater. And by the way, rainwater is good water. It's distilled water, and it doesn't have any of the risks of iron like a well would have with the pipes getting rusty, or I remember my grandparents lived in Lacombe, Alberta, and the city water had so much iron in it that their bathtub was orange and the water coming out was orange, and so iron can be a problem. So anyway, even if you have a well, if you have rainwater, you're not going to have iron. You're not going to have some other pretty serious issues that you could have with a well. And the only thing you might get is some contaminants from smokestack nearby from a factory. Otherwise, the rainwater is really good water. And by the time you go through this process, you've got water that's as good, I think, as a bottled water that you buy. So what he's got here is the first blue tube. It has a filter in it, and it's a particulate filter. And particulates are like dust and dirt and little stuff like that. And so you could even have 3 of these where they would get smaller. Like you could have a coarser filter in the first one and a finer one in the second one. Either way, the last one that he's got his hand on, or the third one in the case of a 3-part one, would be a carbon filter, charcoal filter. So that one really will clean it up. So you're progressively getting it finer and finer so that when it comes out the other end, you don't have any particulates at all. And one other thing that you could add that I don't believe he has, but it would probably be a good idea, is a UV unit. And what this does is then the blue filters here take out any particulates that would float in the water, and then the UV kills any bugs, any microorganisms. So you don't have anything in there to contaminate your drinking water. Now let's talk for a minute about other types of tanks. These are tanks used in industry for a variety of liquids. Some of them are good and some of them are chemicals. If you were going to use some used tanks of this type, you would want to find that they are food grade quality and not something they had some toxic chemicals in, and then you'd want to find out the history of them to know that all they did was had drinking water or something like that. But those are an option. Now when it comes to collecting rainwater for gardening purposes, irrigation, and this is pretty popular for people that live in the city that are into gardening and into organic and all that. They often will do this. They will have one of their downspouts go into a barrel and collect the rainwater because plants like rainwater. They normally get water from rain. And if you're in the city and you're using city water to irrigate your plants, you're putting chlorine and all that stuff on there. So even if you're not collecting rainwater for drinking and for your domestic uses, you may want to collect it for your gardening. So this is there's all kinds of barrels that you can get, collection containers. This one I thought looked pretty cool. Kind of looks like an old oak well, what do you call it? A wine barrel. And so it looks quite attractive even though it's pretty big. One thing is the top of these barrels typically will have a screen, or they should, where the water goes in to collect debris and things, but make sure that your screen is small enough holes that mosquitoes can't get through, because if a mosquito can get in there, then they will love that pool of water to lay their eggs and have more mosquitoes, and you and your neighbors aren't going to like all the mosquitoes you'd have, and you wouldn't realize it's because of the rainwater barrel. They normally will find a puddle or a pool, but you've provided an artificial one if you don't have a good screen. I talked about earlier about the importance of gutter screens. This is what a gutter can look like. You normally don't see it because you don't climb up there and look, but you get, in this case, you've got residue from the 3-tab shingles, you've got leaves, you've got dirt and dust. All that stuff's going to not only plug your gutters, but it's going to go into that collection of rainwater. So you want to keep all that junk out of there when you're collecting water for your own purposes. The other thing is, don't drink the water straight out of a barrel like the one for irrigation, because it's not gone through the filtering process. If you have rainwater collection and you are using it for domestic use and for gardening, you could save the expense of replacing filters and UV by redirecting the water that goes to irrigation to not be filtered. But then just remember, you don't want to go out there and take a drink out of the faucet out in the garden because it's not filtered. The other thing is these decorative garden size barrel collection things. Just like we talked about with those hand-me-down commercial square barrels, you want to do some checking when you decide to retrofit or purchase a barrel for collecting water, whether it's food grade or not. Now, if you're doing irrigation, it does not have to be food grade, but if you're going to be drinking it, then you'd want to make sure it's food grade. And the last thing to consider is whether there are regulations where you live regarding collecting rainwater. This legend here is showing the different geographic areas, the different states, and how they vary. There are some places where it is illegal to collect rainwater. The state of Washington, for instance, has regulations, but it's encouraged that you do it. I would imagine most states are like Washington, where we happen to live. In 1914, the state government, in their wisdom, decided that all water belongs to everybody. Therefore, the state controls it. So if you have a creek on your property, or you drill a well, or you're collecting rainwater, you basically have to have permission from the government to do it if you're going to be legal. And there are some places in the country, and it can vary from county to county, where it is not allowed to collect rainwater. There are some other places where it used to not be allowed, but then there were problems being able to have well water, so then they changed the rules. So you may want to do some research on your particular location, and either be permitted or not permitted, and make it incognito. But either way, the water is provided by the Lord, I believe, and it's important to be able to provide water from one of these methods in your country property. Personally, I think when a person's looking for country property, the ideal is to be able to have a creek or a pond on your property. That's very hard to come by, but if you happen to have that, that's really a prized possession. And this concludes this presentation regarding sources of water.